Pinyon Cross was a town holding its breath, the Arizona Territory, in the year 1881, had decided to try and scour this small collection of wooden skeletons off the map. A sandstorm, born somewhere in the red deserts to the east, had been building for 2 days. Now, it arrived. It was not a wind that whistled. It was a wind that screamed. It carried the high desert with it, a blinding wall of rust-colored grit that reduced the midday sun to a dull, angry smear. The Blue Lantern Saloon, the town's primary anchor against misery, took the assault with a groan. Its sign, painted a hopeful blue that had long since faded to cracked gray, swung violently on one remaining hinge, the metal shrieking in protest. Dust, fine as flour, forced its way through every crack in the window frames, under the door sill, and between the warped floorboards. It settled on the tables, filmed the whiskey glasses seconds after they were wiped, and coated the back of every man's throat, making the cheap liquor a necessity rather than a pleasure. Into this abrasive afternoon walked Calder Nash. He seemed less a man arriving than a piece of the storm itself, separating from the red haze and taking human form. He was gaunt, built of long bone and sinew dried hard by too much sun and too little comfort. He pushed the bat-wing doors open just wide enough to slip inside, then let them slam shut against the gale. He wore the desert's uniform-worn boots, denim trousers faded pale, and a wool coat that was too heavy for the season but necessary against the grit, a pale, silvery scar, shaped like a crescent moon, interrupted the weathered brown skin of his throat, a permanent reminder of a conversation that had gone poorly. The saloon quieted for the half-beat it took to measure him. They saw the throat scar, the holster worn smooth from use, and the gray eyes that took in the room without seeming to move. They saw the heavy leather satchel he carried, gripped tight in his left hand. Satisfied, he was not immediate trouble. The low murmur of voices resumed. Calder moved to the darkest corner of the room, a table that gave him a clear view of the front door and the staircase leading to the rooms above. He dropped the satchel by his boot. It landed with a soft, heavy thud, the sound of dense weight. It was full of San Domingo gold dust, the result of 6 months spent guiding a nervous geologist through Apache territory. It was payment, but it felt more like ballast, the only thing keeping him tied to the earth. He signaled for a beer. When it came, he paid and let the silence of his corner settle over him. He was just passing through. He had no business in Pinyon Cross, save for a horse that needed shoeing and a storm that needed waiting out. But the storm had brought more than dust into the Blue Lantern. It had brought a fever. The talk, kept low against the wind's howl, was not about the weather. It was about money. A man at the bar, broad-shouldered and smelling of stale sweat and impatience, slapped his hand on the warped wood. This was Harlan Pike, a man who made his living reading paper notices and hunting flesh. $600, Pike said, his voice grating enough to carry. That's a hell of a price for a needle pusher. The bartender, a thin man polishing a glass that would be dirty again in a minute, grunted. She's not just a needle pusher now. Pike, she's a killer. Shot the toll manager, they say, point blank. I don't care what she shot him with. Pike spat, draining his glass. $600, and I mean to have it before that storm breaks. Calder listened. His gaze remained fixed on the murky beer in his glass, but his attention was sharp. Isela S. Montoya. He didn't know the name. A seamstress from Nuevo Leon. The talk supplied, accused of murdering the manager of the new toll station on the pass. $600 was a fortune. It was more than a man could make in a year of punching cattle. It was the kind of money that turned neighbors into informants and decent men into hunters. Delphine Rooker, the proprietor of the Blue Lantern, moved through the room with a practiced, weary grace. She was a woman who had seen too many booms and too many busts. Her eyes, the color of ash and smoke, missed nothing. She paused near the center of the room, ostensibly to straighten a worn bearskin rug that lay before the cold hearth. Her boot nudged the edge of the carpet, just an inch, revealing the dark iron ring of a trapdoor latch. She caught the eye of Rue, one of the 2 girls who sang and served on the small, rickety stage. Rue, barely 20, stopped wiping down a table. A silent, tense understanding passed between the women. Rue gave a nearly imperceptible nod and drifted toward the back room, where her stage sister, Lark, was quietly restringing a banjo beneath Delphine's feet in the damp, cool dark of the root cellar. Isela Montoya pressed her back against a row of whiskey barrels. She was shaking, not from the chill, but from a terror so profound it had burned past screaming and settled into a cold, paralyzing silence. She was wrapped in a rough burlap shawl, her dark hair matted with red dust and sweat. Her hands, the hands of a seamstress, were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Bright threads of scarlet and blue were stuck to her cuffs, stark against the dark, flaking crust of dried blood beneath her fingernails. She held her breath, listening to the muffled scrape of boots on the floorboards above. Then she heard it, a new sound, distinct from the wind, the metallic jingle of spurs, crossing the porch outside. Her breath hitched, a dry, painful sob. Harlan Pike, he had come. Calder saw the other law in the room, too. Sheriff Bram Kincaid leaned against the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey. Kincaid was a big man, running to fat, his face flushed with easy authority. He looked at Pike, and then he looked at the door, and then he looked at Delphine. He was a man waiting for a thing to happen. Calder, who had spent a decade charting routes for the railroad, knew exactly what he was seeing. He recognized the smell of curated trouble. He'd seen this play before. A piece of land was needed. A stubborn settler or a difficult claim holder stood in the way. Trouble would arise: a missing herd, a suspicious fire, or, in this case, a murder. A convenient suspect would be found, the law would act swiftly, and the land would suddenly become available, cleared for the advance of the rails. He glanced at Kincaid again. The sheriff was bought. He was the local arm of E. Silcox, the polite, smiling railroad agent who had likely signed the bounty himself. They were framing the girl. It was simple. Dirty arithmetic. Calder had no stake in it. He'd taken the railroad's money for years, driving the stakes and drawing the maps that were the bones of their empire. He'd quit when he saw a family in Santa Noria displaced by a line he himself had surveyed. Their homestead turned to ash because it stood in the way of a water stop. He had quit, but he had not interfered. He had just moved on. He rubbed his thumb absently against the cuff of his left sleeve. It was a nervous habit. Tracing the fabric, the wool was worn thin at the edge, reinforced by a small, tight patch of dark canvas. The stitching was immaculate, the lines perfectly parallel, small and strong. It was a patch he'd gotten 3 years ago, a mark of his old trade, a reminder of the maps he used to carry. The storm, which had seemed incapable of worsening, found a new reserve of fury. It struck the front of the saloon with a force that felt like a physical blow. The main lantern hanging from the central beam, its wick already struggling, finally gave up. The flame sputtered, flared blue, and died, plunging the room into a deep, dusty twilight, lit only by the 2 small lamps behind the bar. The sudden dark, combined with the shriek of the wind, broke the room's spell. Men startled. Pike cursed, pushing away from the bar. "Delphine!" Kincaid's voice boomed, falsely authoritative. "Get that lamp lit." But Delphine Rooker was already moving. She ignored the sheriff and walked directly to the front door. With a grunt of effort, she slammed the heavy iron bolt across the frame. The sound was a definitive, metallic chunk that sealed them all inside. The blue lantern was now a box. She turned, her face a pale mask in the gloom. She looked at Rue, who had reappeared from the back. "Rue!" Delphine's voice was not loud, but it cut through every other sound. "Take her down, all the way, to the back tunnel, now." Harlan Pike froze, his hand dropping to his gun. "Take who down? Delphine, you harboring my bounty." Rue didn't hesitate. She ran to the bearskin rug and threw it aside, revealing the trapdoor. She fumbled with the iron ring, her fingers shaking. "Open it, girl," Delphine ordered, her own hand disappearing beneath the bar. Rue pulled the heavy door open. A square of deeper blackness opened in the floor. From that blackness, a face, pale and streaked with tears and grime, looked up. Isela Montoya, her eyes wide and luminous with pure terror, darted around the room. They saw Kincaid's bulk. They saw Pike's hungry stare. And then, for one frozen second, her eyes met Calder's. He stopped breathing. The light from the bar lamp caught the side of his own coat, the one he was wearing. He looked down, instinctively. At the left cuff he had been rubbing, he saw the neat, precise, impossibly strong stitches. He looked back at the girl in the cellar hole. He knew that handiwork. He knew that needlework. It was the same stitching. 3 years ago, in Santa Noria, after a saloon brawl had ripped his coat open, a young seamstress had fixed it. He'd paid her in silver, struck by the quiet dignity she carried. He had been rubbing her stitches. He was wearing her work. Harlan Pike lunged, knocking a table aside. "She's mine." The fight was no longer a stranger's. The world narrowed to the square of blackness in the floor and the terrified eyes that stared out of it. Harlan Pike, a man who moved with the predatory economy of a wolf, had already covered half the distance. His hand clamped on the butt of his pistol. "She's mine," he roared again, the words muffled by the wind's scream. Kincaid straightened up from the bar, his hand dropping to his own holster, a lazy, proprietary gesture. He was not here to stop Pike. He was here to witness the transaction. Calder's mind, trained to map terrain in an instant, measured the distances. Pike was 5 feet from the trapdoor. Delphine was behind the bar. 4 feet from the sawed-off shotgun he knew she kept there. Rue was frozen, her hand still on the iron ring. And Essie was a ghost from 3 years prior, trapped in a cellar, about to be dragged out and butchered for $600. 3 years. The name on the wind, Isela Montoya, had meant nothing. The face in the cellar meant everything. Santa Noria had been a dust-choked stop on the line, a place where Calder was waiting for a payroll courier. He'd gotten into a fight with 3 graders over a card game he hadn't even been playing in, just watching. It had spilled out of the cantina, and a thrown Bowie knife, meant for his ribs, had sliced his coat from the shoulder to hip. He'd won the fight, but the coat was ruined. Someone pointed him to a small adobe building with a neatly lettered sign. Y. Montoya, seamstress, mending dressmaking. He had entered, filling the small room with the smell of blood, whiskey, and trail dust. She was sitting by a window, her hands moving over a piece of delicate white lace, a stark contrast to the coarse, bloody wool he dropped on her counter. She looked at him, then at the coat, then back at him. Her eyes were dark and steady, not frightened by his appearance, just appraising. "I need this fixed," he'd said, his voice hoarse. She picked it up. She noted the slash, the blood, and the way the fabric was already unraveling. She told him it would take canvas backing and at least 2 hours. He'd nodded, paid for the work up front in silver, and left to wash the blood off his face. When he returned, the coat was not just repaired, it was stronger. She had used a tight, precise backstitch, reinforcing the entire seam. He'd seen stitching like that on high-quality saddles, built to withstand a lifetime of strain. He ran his thumb over the patch, feeling the strength in it. "You have a good hand," he'd said, meaning it as the highest compliment a surveyor could give. "I learned on sailcloth," she replied, her voice soft, her gaze direct. "It has to hold against the wind." He'd lingered, an uncharacteristic hesitation. He was paid by the railroad, an agent of the change that was rolling over the territory, displacing the very people she had come from. He saw the quiet dignity in her, the refusal to be hurried or intimidated. He'd felt a sudden, sharp pang of something he couldn't name. It was respect, but it was warmer than that. He'd put on the coat, feeling the solid repair against his side. He'd added another silver dollar to the counter, more than the work was worth. "This is strong work," he'd said, touching the sleeve. "It will hold." Her eyes met his, and there was a silent, unfinished promise in the air. Not of romance, but of recognition. Two people who understood the value of things that lasted. Then he had walked out, back to his job. His job, that was the worm in the apple. His job, then, had been signing the final survey maps for the new route through Juniper Wash, just north of Pinion Cross. He was good at it. His lines were clean, his calculations precise. He'd walked every mile of it, driving the oak stakes himself, the red flags fluttering in the same wind that blew today. He'd tried not to look at the small homesteads he was bisecting. He'd tried to ignore the faces of the ranchers and the sodbusters who watched him, their eyes hollow. He was just the surveyor. He just drew the line. What the company did with that line, the legal notices, the displacements, the forced sales, that was not his concern. But his conscience had grown heavy. The stakes he drove felt less like markers of progress and more like nails in a coffin. Santa Noria, and the sight of that girl's steady hands, had been the end. He'd finished the Juniper Wash survey, collected his pay, and quit the railroad for good. Now, the past was climbing out of a cellar hole. He pieced it together with the cold, fast logic of a man who reads maps. Pinion Cross existed for one reason: the railroad was coming. The line he himself had drawn through Juniper Wash. Silcox was the railroad agent. Kincaid was the railroad's law. That meant the toll manager, the murdered man, was also a railroad man. And Essa, what was her part? The talk in the saloon answered that. She had accused the manager, the men at the bar, loose-lipped with whiskey and the scent of a manhunt, had said it. The manager had been skimming supplies, stealing from the wagons of migrants passing through. Esse, who still carried the memory of her own journey from Nuevo Leon, had spoken up. She had confronted him. And that night, the manager was found dead. Shot, but not with a common pistol. The rumors Calder had been half listening to now clicked into place. Shot with a heavy-caliber pistol, one bearing a United States Treasury stamp. An official gun, the kind a railroad agent guarding payroll might carry, the kind a small-town seamstress would never, ever possess. It was a setup, clean and brutal. Silcox needed the land cleared, but more, he needed compliance. He needed to make an example of anyone who spoke against the company's interests. He'd found the perfect victim, a woman, alone, with no family, a migrant herself. He'd manufactured a file, signed a warrant, and put Kincaid in charge of executing it. The $600 bounty was not a fee. It was bait. It was designed to unleash the entire territory's greed, to ensure she was hunted down and silenced before she could ever tell her side to a real judge. Last chance. Delphine, Pike snarled, his pistol now clear of the holster. Give her up. Delphine Rooker didn't flinch. Her hand, which had been under the bar, reappeared. It held a double-barreled shotgun, its bores dark and wide as tunnels. She didn't aim it at Pike. She rested it on the bar, pointed at the ceiling. But her thumb was on the hammer. It was a statement. You're not taking anyone from my cellar. Harlan, she said, her smoky voice flat. Not while the storm rages. Bad for business. To hell with your business. Get out. Pike looked at Kincaid. The sheriff sighed, pushing himself off the bar. This was the part he hated, the actual work. Now, Delphine, Kincaid said, trying for a reasonable tone. We have a warrant for Isela Montoya. You're obstructing justice. Give her to Pike. She's a guest. Delphine said she was thinking of a dusty cantina in Sonora 20 years ago when she was a traveling singer with a broken guitar and no money. S's mother, a woman with the same steady eyes, had given her a room, fed her, and bought her a ticket on a stagecoach north. Delphine paid her debts. She had whispered to Essa in the dark cellar. Hours ago. The storm will cover us. When it breaks, I'll get you on the old trail through Coyote Gate Pass. You'll be in Mexico by dawn. Calder watched this, his hand still on his cup. He had not moved. He, too, had a debt. He had come back to Pinion Cross for his own reasons. 2 weeks ago, in Prescott, he'd seen a land claim notice, a large parcel in Juniper Wash, transferred to a holding company called Prescott Southern. The transfer was based on a resurvey that nullified the older homestead claims. The surveyor's signature on the bottom of the new map was clear, precise, and a complete forgery. Calder Nash. They were using his name. They were using his reputation, his clean lines, to steal land from the very people he'd felt guilty about displacing years ago. His signature, the one thing that was his and his alone, was being used as a weapon. The two stories slammed together in his gut. The forged maps were Silcox's. The girl in the cellar was Silcox's. It was all one motion. Steal the land. Silence the witnesses. And he, Calder Nash, was the ghost underwriting the whole damn thing. The saloon was a powder keg. Lark, at the stage, began to pluck nervously at her banjo. The tune was disjointed, a broken-winged bird trying to fly. Pike was pacing now, his spurs a rhythmic, angry jingle against the floorboards. "You're making a mistake. Woman!" Pike yelled at Delphine. "Rue!" Seeing Delphine's shotgun, suddenly found her voice. She began to sing, loudly, desperately. A bawdy tune about a traveling salesman. He had a trunk of wondrous things, of golden chains and ruby rings. Her voice was shrill, cracking with fear. An attempt to build a wall of sound around the trap door. Lark saw the move and joined in, her banjo finding a frantic, galloping rhythm. Calder decided. He would not let another person be buried because of a line he drew or a name he owned. His past guilt and his present anger fused into a single, cold point of clarity. He felt the weight of the satchel by his boot. The San Domingo gold. It was his escape, his new start. Now, it was something else. It was a tool. He knew men like Pike. He knew men like Kincaid and Silcox. They didn't believe in justice. They believed in weight. The weight of a gun, the weight of the law, and above all, the weight of gold. His voice, quiet and unused, cut through the terrible singing in the wind. "How much?" Pike stopped pacing. Kincaid stopped moving. The banjo music died, a string snapping with a sharp twang. Calder Nash looked up, his gray eyes pinning Harlan Pike. He did not look at the gun. He looked at the man. "How much for the warrant?" he asked, his voice calm. Pike stared, confused. "What's it to you, surveyor?" $600, you said." Calder's hand moved, not to his gun, but to the heavy leather satchel at his feet. He lifted it and placed it on the table with a solid, definitive thud. He remembered his own words to Essa. 3 years ago, "This is strong work. It will hold." He looked at Delphine, then at the trap door. He would make it hold. He laid his hand on the satchel. The fastest way to bend a black hand, he thought, is to pay the shadow to leave. "I'll buy her," Calder said to the stunned room. "I'll pay the bounty. In gold." The saloon was trapped in a vacuum of shocked silence, a tiny, dark bubble insulated from the screaming wind. Harlan Pike's greedy. Surprised eyes were fixed on the heavy satchel on Calder's table. Sheriff Kincaid, who had been moving with the lazy confidence of a man holding all the cards, stopped, his hand hovering over his gun, his expression souring. He had not anticipated this. He had not anticipated a stranger with a bag heavy enough to buy a life. Delphine Rooker's thumb remained pressed against the shotgun's hammer, but her gaze flickered to Calder, a new, sharp calculation in her smoky eyes. "Gold," Pike said, his voice a low rasp, tasting the word. He took a step toward the table, ignoring Delphine, ignoring Kincaid. "You're offering gold for the bounty." "That's what I said." Calder replied, his voice flat. He didn't open the bag. The weight was enough. $600. Your price. I can't just sell a warrant, mister." Pike stammered, but his eyes said he was already counting. "He's right," Kincaid blustered, finding his footing. "This is official territory business. The woman is wanted for murder. You are interfering with a lawful action." Calder looked at Kincaid, his gray eyes devoid of heat. "I'm not interfering. Sheriff, I'm resolving. The bounty is a contract. I'm offering to fulfill it, unless you have a personal stake in her capture." That hit the mark. Kincaid's face flushed a deeper red. He was the law, but he was also Silcox's man, and this was not part of the plan. Gold complicated the clean arithmetic of the frame-up. This ain't a discussion for the bar, Pike said quickly, his mind racing. He saw his $600, and he saw the sheriff, a man who might try to claim a piece of it. The back room. We'll talk. Calder nodded, grabbing the satchel. After you. Pike led the way to a small, foul-smelling room behind the stage, used for storage and high-stakes card games. A single lantern cast oily shadows on the walls. Calder kicked the door shut with his boot, leaving Kincaid fuming in the main room. "Show me the gold," Pike demanded, his veneer of professionalism gone. Calder dropped the satchel on the card table. It landed with the same heavy, satisfying thud as before. He untied the leather thong and folded back the flap. The dim light caught the dull, heavy sheen of raw gold dust, packed tight in canvas pouches. Pike inhaled, a small, sharp sound. "This is more than 600, Pike whispered. "This is my business," Calder said. He pulled one medium-sized pouch from the bag. "This is your bounty, but I'm not buying a dead girl. Pike, I'm buying the paper she's on." "The warrant." Pike was suspicious. "What for?" "I don't like loose ends," Calder said, tapping the main satchel. "I'm invested in this territory. I'm buying the warrant, and I'm buying your silence. You take the gold, you ride out, and you tell Kincaid the trail went cold. You tell him she was never here." Pike licked his lips. It was an easy trade. $600 in gold. Clean, no questions, and no need to risk his hide dragging a spitting, screaming woman back to a corrupt sheriff. "Let me see the warrant first," Calder said. "I'm paying for iron. I want to make sure it's not rust." Pike, his eyes glued to the pouch, pulled a folded, sweat-stained paper from his coat. "It's official, signed by Judge Thorne in Prescott." Calder took the paper and unfolded it under the lamplight. He was a man who understood paper. He had lived by his maps, by the precise lines and the legal descriptions. He scanned the dense, hurried script. His eyes stopped. "It's signed by the judge," Calder said, his voice quiet. "But it was filed by a lawyer, Grady Elwell." "That's right," Pike said, eager to prove its value. "Elwell. He's the railroad's top man. Handles all their claims. When he files something, it sticks. It's ironclad." "Elwell," Calder repeated. The name clicked. Grady Elwell was Silcox's personal lawyer. A man known for finding loopholes in Homestead claims a blind man could not see. He read the warrant again, his focus sharpening. "Gisela Montoya y Garza," he read aloud. He looked up at Pike. "What?" Pike said, growing impatient. "Her name," Calder said. "The woman who patched my coat in Santa Noria. Her mother's people were the Reyes. Her name is Gisela Montoya y Reyes." Pike shrugged, reaching for the gold. "Garza, Reyes. What's the difference? It's a name. It's her." "That," Calder said, a cold understanding dawning, "is all the difference." He knew the trick. It was the vilest, most common swindle in the territory. A misspelled name, a voidable contract. If they captured her and she signed a confession, she would be signing as Garza, a legal fiction. Her signature would be worthless. But it would be enough to close the file. But more importantly, any land claim she held, any property she owned as Reyes, would be untouchable by Garza. This warrant was not just for her body. It was designed to legally separate her from her life, to make her a non-person. It was a document of seizure, not justice. "Here's the 600, Calder said, pushing the pouch across the table. Pike's hand snatched it like a striking snake. "And here," Calder added, pulling a much smaller pouch from his pocket, "is another 200. That buys your memory. You forget the name. You forget this room. You forget Pinion Cross." Pike weighed the first pouch, his smile reptilian. He pocketed the second without looking at it. "As far as I'm concerned, that seamstress is a ghost. She vanished in the storm." He paused, jerking a thumb toward the main room. "But he's still out there. Kincaid, he ain't in it for the cash. He wants her for Silcox. He won't stop. Kincaid is my problem." Calder said. He folded the warrant his warrant now and tucked it inside his coat. When Calder returned to the bar, Pike was gone, having slipped out the back door into the wind. Kincaid was waiting, his face thunderous. "Where's Pike? Where's the prisoner?" "Pike took the Golden Road," Calder said calmly, taking his seat in the corner. "He said the warrant was thin and the storm was thick. He's given up the hunt. He—" "What?" Kincaid was apoplectic. This was a disaster. Silcox would have his hide. "He can't do that. That's a lawful warrant." "It's a paid contract," Calder said. "It's done. Have a drink. Sheriff?" "It's a hard night." Kincaid stared at Calder, his mind working, full of suspicion and rage, but the gold was gone, and so was the bounty hunter. He was alone. He slammed his glass on the bar, causing Delphine to look up, her hand still near her shotgun. Kincaid spun on his heel and stalked out of the saloon, bracing himself against the storm, his mind clearly racing to the depot office to telegraph Silcox. The moment the door slammed shut, Delphine bolted it. She looked at Calder. "You just spent $600 on a girl you met once. I spent it on a piece of paper," Calder said. He motioned to the trapdoor. "Is she safe?" "For now." Delphine nodded to Rue and Lark, who had watched the entire exchange, pale and silent. "Girls, watch the door. Don't let anyone in, not even God." She jerked her head at Calder. "Upstairs, my office." Her office was small, neat, and smelled of sandalwood and old account books. She poured 2 glasses of brandy, her hands perfectly steady. She pushed one toward Calder. "You didn't buy her freedom," Delphine said, her voice low. "You just bought her time. Kincaid and Silcox won't stop. Now it's not about a bounty. It's about burying a witness." "I know," Calder said. He told her about the name on the warrant. Montoya y Garza. Delphine's eyes narrowed. Elwell's work. That snake. He used the same trick to take Old Man Hemlock's ranch last year. Misspelled the family name on the foreclosure notice. By the time the old man proved who he was, his land belonged to the Prescott Southern Company. "PSQO, Calder said, the letters tasting like ash. "That's why I'm here. They're using my name, my forged signature, to validate those same claims." The two of them looked at each other. 2 separate threads of the same conspiracy, now twisted together. "Kincaid," Calder said. "He's the key. Pike said he's in it for land, not cash. He's in it for whatever Silcox tells him to be in it for." Delphine said. She went to a small, locked chest and opened it. She rooted around and pulled out a small, dark object. She tossed it on the desk between them. It was a heavy brass button, tarnished and caked with dried mud. "The night the toll manager was killed," Delphine said. "Kincaid was here, celebrating, hours before the body was found. He got drunk, stumbled on the stairs. I found this the next morning." Calder picked it up. It was heavy, military grade. Stamped into the brass face were 4 letters PSCO, Prescott Southern Company. Calder said it was a uniform button. Kincaid wasn't just the town sheriff. He was a company man, wearing a company uniform under his own vest. The dominoes were beginning to line up. A frantic scratching came at the door. It was Rue. Delphine let her in. The girl was breathing hard, her shawl soaked. "I followed him," Rue panted, addressing Calder. "Like you said, I followed Kincaid. He didn't go to the telegraph, he went to the depot office. The old one, by the tracks." "What's he doing?" Calder asked. "He's burning them," Rue said, her eyes wide. "I climbed on the livery roof. I could see through the window. He's burning the toll ledgers, the old ones. I saw the fire reflecting in his spectacles. It looked like his eyes were on fire." Calder and Delphine locked eyes. The toll manager was skimming. Essa knew it. The ledgers would prove it. Kincaid wasn't just a killer. He was cleaning up the original crime, destroying the motive. "Lark," Delphine said, turning to the other girl, who had slipped in behind Rue. "The county office. Can you—" Lark nodded. She was the smaller of the two, quiet and fast. "The back window latch is broken. I can be in and out in 10 minutes." "Go." Calder said, handing her a pencil and a piece of paper from Delphine's desk. "Don't take anything. Just copy the new claimant list, the one for Juniper Wash. Go!" Lark vanished. They sat in silence for what felt like an hour. Calder drank his brandy. Delphine cleaned her shotgun. Rue stood by the window, watching the street. Lark returned like a ghost, sliding back into the room. She was dry. She hadn't even made a sound. She handed the paper to Calder. He read the list. It was short. Juniper Holdings, LLC, Verde Valley Investments, Arizona Development Group, Shell Companies, he said, his voice flat. "All of them," Delphine said, pointing a finger at the bottom of the page. "Notarized last week. Look at the signature." Calder looked. The notary was Grady Elwell. The trap was complete. Silcox, through Elwell, used Calder's forged maps to file claims under fake company names. To silence any local complaints, he used Kincaid to murder his own skimming toll manager, who had become a liability. He framed Essa for the murder, using Elwell to draft a flawed warrant that would also strip her of her property. "Murder," Calder said, laying the pieces out on the table. "To create a scapegoat. A frame-up, to get her. A land grab, to get the valley. A railroad, to tie it all together. It all comes back to Silcox." Delphine finished. Calder stood up, pacing the small room. He picked up the button. He looked at the copied list. He touched the warrant in his pocket. He had the proof, but they were in a locked saloon, in a town owned by the man they were trying to expose. He stopped pacing. He looked at Delphine. "I bought the warrant," he said. "That was the first move. It bought us time. It took the hounds off the trail. But Kincaid is still out there, and he's burning the last of the evidence. He won't stop." "Calder," Delphine said. "He knows Pike left. He'll assume she's here. He'll come back, and he won't be serving a warrant. He'll be tying up a loose end." "I know," Calder said. He picked up his satchel of gold, the heavy ballast that had tied him to this town. "I paid to get her off the bounty block. Now we use the rest of this to get her out of the cellar and get this evidence to a judge who isn't on the payroll." He looked at the door. His jaw set. The first step was complete. The investigation was done. Now, the fight began. The rage of the storm had passed. It had not left. It had merely settled. The screaming wind fell away, replaced by a thick, suffocating fog of red dust that hung in the air like a shroud, turning the world outside the Blue Lantern Saloon a deep, bloody crimson. The silence that fell in the wake of the gale was heavier and more terrifying than the noise had been. Every sound inside was now sharp. Distinct the metallic tap of Lark's fingernail on her banjo string, the creak of a floorboard upstairs, the hiss of the lone lantern still burning on the bar. A heavy, deliberate fist struck the bolted front door. Thump, thump, thump. Upstairs in Delphine's small office, Calder, Delphine, Rue, and Lark froze. They had just finished laying the dominoes of the conspiracy end to end. And now the man who had set them in motion was at the door. "Kincaid," Rue whispered, her face pale. "No," Calder said. His voice was cold. He recognized the rhythm. He grabbed his satchel of evidence and the much heavier bag of gold. "Pike, he double-crossed me." They hurried down the stairs into the main room, dark and eerie in the red twilight filtering through the dusty windows. Delphine moved to the front, pulling the heavy velvet curtain aside just enough to see the street. She let it fall, her face grim. "He's back, and he brought friends, 2 men I don't know, hard cases wearing railroad dusters." The knocking stopped. It was replaced by the sudden, splintering crack of a heavy boot kicking the door jamb. They were done asking. "Delphine," Calder said, his voice low and urgent, commanding. "The back door. The beer wagon you said was in the alley. Get Rue and Lark ready. I need a distraction." "What are you doing?" she snapped, her hand already moving toward her shotgun. "Buying one last minute," Calder said. He strode to the center of the room, to the long, polished bar. He heaved the heavy satchel of San Domingo gold onto the wood. The thud was as loud as a gunshot in the tense quiet. He untied the leather thong, deliberately pulling the top open, letting the small, dense canvas pouches of gold dust spill partially into view. The front door burst open, the broken bolt flying across the room and smashing against the far wall. Harlan Pike stepped in, his pistol already in his hand. His face was a mask of triumphant greed. The two railroad thugs fanned out on either side of him, their rifles leveling on Delphine, on Rue, on Lark, and finally on Calder. That was a mistake. Surveyor. Pike sneered, his eyes instantly locking on the pile of gold. You should have kept riding when you had the chance. You bought a warrant, but you didn't buy me. A fourth man shouldered his way through the broken door, stamping the red dust from his boots. Sheriff Bram Kincaid. He smelled powerfully of wet horse, cheap tobacco, and the sour righteousness of corrupt authority. He saw the gold on the bar, and his eyes lit with a pleasure that was almost sensual. He looked at Calder and smiled. "Well, well," Kincaid boomed, his voice oozing false geniality. "Pike here tells me you're a man of significant means, a man who likes to buy paper, a man who likes to hide murderers." Calder stood tall, his hands held open and away from his body, a picture of calm. "This is the price," he said, his voice cutting through the sheriff's bluster. He slapped the bag of gold. The jingle of coins and the soft thud of the pouches echoed in the room. "This is the bounty for the girl, $600, and the rest," he slapped it again, "is the price for the silence of every man in this room tonight. You take the gold, you mount your horses, and you ride away. You never saw her. You never saw me." The gold gleamed in the dim light. It was a fortune. The two railroad men glanced at each other, their trigger fingers visibly loosening. This was more than Silcox was paying them for a year of breaking heads. Pike took an involuntary step, his hand twitching, wanting to snatch it. But Kincaid put a thick arm across Pike's chest, stopping him. The sheriff's smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. "That's a fine offer, Mr. Nash," Kincaid said, walking slowly toward the bar. "A truly fine offer. But gold is deaf, gold is dumb. It can't testify. It can't tell Mr. Silcox that the situation is resolved." He tapped his temple. "A signature, on the other hand. A signature on a full confession. Now that speaks volumes. And Mr. Silcox, he does appreciate a story with a tidy ending." Kincaid's hand dropped to his holster, and his smile vanished. "I'll take the gold. And I'll take the girl, Delphine. Open the cellar." This was the signal. Delphine, standing at the far end of the bar, looked at Rue. The girl was shaking, but she nodded, her eyes fixed on her mistress. "One." Kincaid took a heavy step toward the bearskin rug covering the trap door. "I said, open it, you old witch, two." "Now!" Rue screamed. But she didn't run. She grabbed the nearest full whiskey bottle from a table and, with all her strength, hurled it underhand at the main bar lamp, the only good light in the room. 3. The bottle shattered against the lamp's brass base. Glass, oil, and whiskey exploded outward. The lamp, its balance gone, toppled from its hook and crashed onto the floorboards, which were already soaked in spirits. The floor erupted in a sheet of greasy, roaring flame. A wave of oily black smoke billowed upward, instantly plunging the room into chaos. "Damn you!" Kincaid roared, firing his pistol blind into the smoke. 4. Lark, who had been standing by the rickety stage, kicked the heavy corner table Calder had occupied. It slid across the floor with a tortured scrape, crashing hard into the legs of the nearest railroad thug. The man yelled, his rifle discharging into the ceiling as he went down. Plaster and dust rained from above. 5. Calder was already moving. He was not a gunman. He was a surveyor. He understood distance and time. He had been standing 12 feet from the trapdoor. He crossed it in 2 long, silent strides. He kicked the rug aside and ripped the iron ring, flinging the heavy door open with a crash. "It's a hand now." A pale hand, smeared with dirt, shot up from the blackness. Calder grabbed her wrist, his grip a steel trap. In one fluid, powerful motion, He hauled her bodily out of the cellar. She stumbled, coughing, and he spun her, shoving her hard toward the dark hallway that led to the kitchen and the back door. The entire sequence, from Rue's throw to the S's release, had taken less than 5 heartbeats. The saloon exploded into a deafening war. Pike and the remaining railroad man opened fire, their muzzle flashes lighting the dark, smoke-filled room in strobing, demonic bursts of orange. "Get her, get her!" Pike screamed, his voice cracking. Bullets tore the room apart. They hammered into the wooden bar, sending splinters flying. They ripped through the shelves of glassware behind Delphine, and the air filled with the sound of an avalanche of shattering glass. Bottles exploded, spraying the air with whiskey, gin, and brandy, which fed the growing fire. Shards of glass rained onto the floorboards, rolling like handfuls of sharp, glittering stones. The noise was a nightmare, the roar of the flames, the boom of the guns, the incessant, high-pitched smashing of glass. Calder shoved Essa through the hallway door. "Rue Lark, go move!" The 2 girls, their faces masks of terror, scrambled after Essa, vanishing into the darkness of the back rooms. Kincaid, his eyes stinging from the smoke, saw the movement, a flicker of skirts disappearing into the gloom. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at the dark, empty doorway. A boom shook the entire building, a sound so loud it seemed to stop the air. It was not a pistol. Delphine Rooker, standing steady as a rock behind her burning bar, had fired the first barrel of her shotgun. The blast of buckshot went high, a deliberate warning, shredding the wall 2 feet above Kincaid's head. The sheriff felt the wind of its passage. He looked up, stunned. The shot had sheared his hat from his head, the felt spinning away into the smoke like a dead bird. He froze, his arm dropping. The message received loud and clear. Delphine's hands moved with practiced speed, breaking the shotgun. The shuck-shuck of her ejecting the spent shell and racking the second one into the chamber was the most terrifying sound in the room. The fire was spreading fast, climbing the curtains. The smoke was a choking, blinding fog. Pike, his eyes burning, saw his chance. Kincaid was pinned by the shotgun. The surveyor and the girl were gone, but the gold was still on the bar, its leather bag silhouetted by the flames. He made a lunge for it, his greed overpowering his fear. "It's mine," he choked, grabbing the heavy satchel. He spun to run, not for the front door, but for the stairs. He'd take the high ground, get out a window, and leave them all to burn. He hit the staircase at a dead run. His boot landed on the 3rd step. Delphine, who had rebuilt this saloon with her own hands, knew every rotten plank. She knew the riser on the 3rd step was riddled with dry rot. She'd always meant to fix it. Instead, she'd left it, a small piece of private security for a night exactly like this. The wood did not crack. It disintegrated. Pike screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and surprise. His leg plunged through the riser up to his thigh. The splintered, rotten wood snapped inward, trapping his leg like a rusty bear trap. He fell forward, the heavy bag of gold flying from his grasp. The satchel burst open as it hit the floor, scattering canvas pouches and a cloud of gold dust into the smoky air. His pistol, jolted from his hand, skittered away into the darkness under a table. He was trapped, screaming, as the flames began to lick at the foot of the stairs. "The back! They're in the back!" Kincaid roared at his remaining man, ignoring Pike's desperate cries. Calder, Essa, Rue, and Lark burst through the kitchen's back door into the alley. The air was blessedly cold, the red dust still thick but breathable. The roar of the fire and the muffled gunshots were behind them. An old, flatbed beer wagon was hitched to the rail, its single dray horse stamping nervously, its eyes wide. "Up!" Calder yelled. He grabbed Rue by the arm and threw her onto the flatbed. Lark scrambled up beside her. He turned to Essa. She was frozen, her lungs heaving. He didn't wait. He put his hands on her waist, his thumbs digging into her ribs, and lifted her effortlessly. She landed on the rough planks and scrambled to the front. Calder swung himself up into the driver's seat and grabbed the worn leather reins. The kitchen door behind them slammed shut. A heavy iron bar crashed down on the other side. The sound final. Delphine Rooker, her face smeared with soot, her hair wild, appeared at the alley's mouth. She was carrying her shotgun and the smaller, remaining bag of gold, the $200 Calder had given Pike, which the man had dropped in his haste. She threw the bag to Calder. "She's all yours, surveyor," Delphine yelled over the din. She turned back to the saloon. The two railroad men, trapped in the alley, were pounding on the locked and barred kitchen door. Delphine calmly reached for the small, painted wooden sign that hung by the alley gate. She hung it neatly on the door's handle, right in front of the furious men. It read, "Closed for storm." Calder snapped the reins. "Hia!" The horse, desperate to flee the noise and fire, lunged forward. The heavy wagon wheels spun, gripped the muddy alley, and they shot out into the red swirling twilight of Pinon Cross, leaving the smoke, the screams, and the Blue Lantern Saloon to its fate. The heavy beer wagon hit the dry bed of the Arroyo del Viento with a crash that rattled their bones, but Calder did not slow the horse. He drove it hard into the scrubland, away from the faint, rising glow of Pinon Cross. The air was finally clean, scoured by the storm, and it rushed over them, blessedly cold. It carried the sharp, medicinal scent of wild mint crushed by the wheels and the alkaline smell of the damp earth. Mixed with it was the pungent, honest smell of the horse's sweat, a smell of life and desperation and escape. Behind them, Rue and Lark huddled together on the flatbed, wrapped in a discarded grain sack. Calder sat on the driver's bench, the reins tight in one hand, the bag of evidence and the small pouch of Pike's gold tucked in his belt. Beside him, Isela Montoya Esse was a small, rigid shape, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench so hard her knuckles were white. She was shaking. It was not just the cold, though the night air was biting after the superheated air of the saloon. It was a deep, bone-grinding tremor. The delayed shock of days of terror, culminating in the fiery, deafening chaos of their escape. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Calder could feel the tremors radiating from her, even though they were not touching. He drove on in silence for what felt like an hour, pushing the horse northeast, following the pale line of a dry wash, until the glow of the burning saloon was nothing but a faint, angry pulse against the horizon. He finally pulled the weary horse to a stop under the collapsing roof of Sawmill Flats, a long-abandoned stable and corral that had been wrecked by a flash flood years prior. The place was a skeleton, but a low line of stalls still had a partial roof, offering cover from the open desert and the wind. "We rest here," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Horse needs water, and you need to be out of the wind." He jumped down, his limbs stiff. He unhitched the horse, led it to a half-broken cistern, and used his hat to scoop up the meager, algae-filmed rainwater at the bottom. The horse drank greedily. Rue and Lark slid off the back, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide and haunted. They clutched each other's hands. "What now?" "Calder?" Rue asked, her voice small. The bravado she'd shown in the saloon completely gone. "Now, you watch," he said, his tone not unkind, but firm. He pointed to a small rise 30 yards away, a pile of flood-tossed boulders that gave a clear view of their back trail. "Huddle there. One of you sleeps. One of you watches. If you see so much as a dust devil, you come running. Switch every hour. It'll be dawn in 4. The two girls, accustomed to taking orders from Delphine, nodded and trudged off, pulling the grain sack tight around their shoulders. Calder watched them settle, two small shapes against the dark, before turning his attention to Essa. She had not moved from the wagon bench. She was still sitting bolt upright, her hands locked on the wood. "Essa," he said gently. She didn't respond. He reached up, and his hand closed over her too, which were locked on the rail. They were ice cold. "It's over," he said. "We're out. You have to get down now." He felt her try to unclench her fingers, but they wouldn't obey. With a quiet strength, He unlaced her frozen grip from the wood, one finger at a time. Her hands, when he finally freed them, remained curled in a tight, claw-like grip. He put his hands on her waist, the same way he had lifted her into the wagon. She was impossibly light, as if she were made of dry twigs and air. He set her on her feet, but her legs buckled. He caught her, his arm instinctively wrapping around her ribs, pulling her against his chest to keep her from falling. She let out a small, broken sound, half sob, half gasp, and her body finally gave up its rigid fight. She went limp against him, her head falling against his shoulder. He could feel the violent, uncontrolled shiver that racked her entire frame. He touched his hand to her forehead. She was burning with fever. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you. Just breathe." He led her, half carrying her, into the deepest, most protected of the ruined stalls. The floor was deep with old, dry straw and flood debris. He let her sink to the ground, her back against a heavy wooden beam that supported what was left of the roof. She immediately curled into herself, her arms wrapped around her knees, her teeth chattering. A cold breeze funneled through the ruined building, carrying the chill of the high desert night. Essa flinched, a low sound of misery escaping her. Calder looked at her, at the thin cotton dress she wore, smeared with cellar dirt and soot. He looked at his own coat, the one she had mended, still smelling of smoke and gunfire. Without a word, he took it off. The wool was heavy, coarse, and still held his body heat. He draped it over her shoulders, pulling the lapels closed, tucking it tight around her. As he did, his fingers brushed the side of her neck and the back of her hand. Her skin was fever-hot, but his hand was calloused, solid, and warm. The simple, non-threatening touch was more than she could bear. A single tear, hot and fast, slid from her closed eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He said nothing about the tear. He found an old, stiff canvas tarp in the corner, once used to cover a wagon. It was stiff as iron, but it was thick. He shook it out, a cloud of ancient dust exploding from it, and settled it over her, tucking it around her like a second, heavier blanket. Then he sat down, not close enough to crowd her, but not far enough to be separate. He settled his own back against the same heavy beam, their shoulders a foot apart. They sat in the dark, a wall of ruined adobe protecting them from the wind, their only light a sliver of moon through a hole in the roof. From the boulders outside, they could hear the faint, heartbreaking sound of roo and lark, one of them singing softly. A broken, off-key melody, a hymn that cracked with exhaustion and fear. For a long time, the only sounds were the horse stamping and the girl's fragile song. "My mother," Essa said, her voice a dry, feverish rasp. "She used to say you could not trust a place that had no songs. I think she was wrong. Pinyon Cross has songs. They are just all lies." Calder was silent for a moment, letting her find her own words. "What happened after Santa Noria?" She began to talk. The fever, the darkness, the exhaustion, all of it unlocked her. She spoke of leaving Santa Noria after her mother died, of looking for work. She spoke of the journey, the men who tried to cheat her, the women who offered kindness and then stole from her. She spoke of arriving in Pinyon Cross, of the small shop she had opened, of the pride in her work. Her voice was flat, relating facts, not asking for pity. She was a surveyor of her own small, hard life. She told him about the toll manager, how she had seen him swap high-grade flour for rotted meal in the sacks of a migrant family. She had confronted him. He had laughed. 2 nights later, Kincaid had come to her shop, his face flushed with whiskey. He and Elwell. The lawyer. They had pushed a paper at her, a relocation grant. They called it Money to Move Her Shop. She saw the name on it, Isela Montoya y Garza. "It was not my name," she whispered, her voice fierce. "It was an insult, a ghost name. I refused to sign. I told them I knew what the manager was doing. Elwell." He smiled. "He told me I had a very dangerous memory. The next morning, the manager was dead, and my name was on a warrant." Calder listened, his face a hard mask in the shadows. Every word she spoke was another nail, driven into the wood of Silcox's frame. He did not interrupt. He did not offer hollow promises or easy comfort. When she spoke of Elwell, his jaw tightened. When she spoke of Kincaid, his hand rested for a second on the butt of his gun, but he just listened, his silence a solid, safe thing in the dark. She finished her story, and the silence stretched out again, but it was a different silence. It was shared. The fever was making her shiver again, harder this time, despite the coat and the tarp. Without a word, Calder shifted. He moved the few inches that separated them, settling his side firmly against hers. He pulled the stiff canvas tarp, readjusting it so it covered both of them, his shoulder against her shoulder, his hip against her hip. He was a wall of solid warmth. She could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing, the strength in his back as he leaned against the beam. Their breathing began to sink in the dark, a quiet, shared cadence. "You should sleep," he said, his voice low, almost a rumble in his chest. "I will watch." She was so tired, but her mind was still on fire. She was safe, for now. She was with the man who had bought her life. She felt for his hand, not in a romantic gesture, but as an anchor. Her cold, shaking fingers found his wrist. Her thumb brushed over the thick, ropey scar on his throat, and she flinched, remembering the cause. Then her hand moved, finding his left arm. Her fingers traced the rough wool of his shirt. And then, underneath, they found the familiar, raised line of old, hard stitching, the patch, the repair she had made 3 years ago. It was still holding. A small, faint smile touched Calder's lips. He could feel her tracing the stitches in the dark. A seamstress's unconscious inspection. "Your stitch work," he said, his voice quiet, "is surprisingly durable." She let out a small, breathy laugh, the first sound of true life he had heard from her. "I told you, I learned on sailcloth. It holds against the wind." She turned her head, her face buried in the smoky wool of his shirt. He looked down at her. He could not see her features, only the pale shape of her face, the dark mass of her hair. All the barriers were down. They were just two people, alive after a fire, hidden in a ruin. He moved his hand, the one she was holding, turning it, lacing his fingers with hers. Her hand was small, calloused at the fingertips, but it fit into his. He leaned down. She tilted her head up. The first kiss was slow. It was hesitant, almost questioning. It was not born of passion, but of a profound, shared relief. It was the taste of smoke and dust and the salt of her single tear. It was a promise of safety, an acknowledgement of the debt he owed her, the life she had saved with her needle, the life he had saved with his gold. He was careful, as if he was afraid of breaking something so fragile it had only just survived. She responded, her hand tightening in his. Her other hand, which had been clutching the coat, moved up. It rested on his jaw, her fingers cool against his skin. It was an invitation. The kiss deepened. It was no longer hesitant. It was a drawing in of life. His hand moved from hers, cupping the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her steady. Her hand slid from his jaw to the back of his neck, her fingers gripping him, anchoring herself to him. It was a kiss of profound, desperate gratitude, of two people who had seen the absolute worst of the frontier and had found, in each other, a single point of reference. It was a kiss that sealed the bargain, that erased the past 3 years, that brought the man in the Santa Noria cantina and the woman in the Pinon Cross cellar together. It was warm and deep, and it was enough. He broke the kiss slowly, resting his forehead against hers. Her breath was hot against his lips, mingling with his. He could feel the feverish pulse in her temple, the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs. She was still shaking, but it was softer now. "You are safe," he whispered, his lips brushing her skin. It was the only promise he could make. "I will not let them take you." She did not reply. She only burrowed deeper, her face pressed against the scar on his throat, her arms sliding around his waist, holding on as if he were the last solid thing on earth. He held her, his arms strong around her, the canvas tarp and his own coat a fortress against the cold and the dark. Outside, the wind whispered through the ruined timbers, and the horse stamped, and Rue and Lark's weary hymn finally faded into the silence of the coming dawn. Dawn broke gray and cold, a bruised light that offered no warmth. The fire at the Blue Lantern had been contained, leaving a charred, smoking husk that smelled of wet ash and defeat. But the conspiracy, Calder knew, had not burned with it. They were holed up in Owen Brack's forge, a cavernous, soot-stained building on the edge of town, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer on the anvil providing a steady, industrial heartbeat that masked their whispers. Essa, her fever broken by a night of restless sleep and Calder's proximity, was pale, but her eyes were clear. She was mending Brack's heavy leather apron, her hands needing the simple, honest work. Rue, who had slipped out at first light, burst back in, her face stricken. She had gone to the new courthouse, a small brick structure, to read the day's postings. "He's done it," she panted, her voice tight with panic. "Silcox, he's not even pretending anymore. He didn't go to the telegraph office. He went straight to the visiting magistrate. He's sworn out a new warrant, not for murder, for kidnapping." Kidnapping Delphine, who had joined them after securing her ruined saloon, spat on the forge floor. "Kidnapping who?" "Us," Rue said, her eyes wide. "He's claiming Calder Nash, Delphine Rooker, Rue, and Lark did by force of arms and conflagration kidnap the prisoner Ysela Montoya from the lawful custody of Sheriff Kincaid." The magistrate signed it. Calder, who had been cleaning his pistol, slowly stopped. The oiled rag held motionless. "And the effect? It gives Kincaid new paper," Rue said, her voice dropping. "It deputizes Silcox's railroad men, and it authorizes them to use any force necessary against those named for resisting a lawful writ. It's not a bounty. Calder, it's a death warrant. It says he can shoot on sight." A new, colder silence filled the forge. The hammer blows from the front of the shop felt distant. They were no longer fugitives with evidence. They were outlaws, declared enemies of the territory, to be shot like rabid dogs. "Then we changed the field," Calder said, his voice quiet, cutting through the fear. "We were running, now we stop. We were hiding, now we countersue." "With what?" Delphine asked. "My saloon is ash. The evidence is just our word against his paper. We have more than our word." Calder said. He looked at Essa. "And we have a new destination. Kincaid thinks we're running for the border. Silcox thinks he can burn us out." He pointed toward the center of town. "We're going to the one place they can't burn. St. Calliope's Chapel." "Father Miguel?" Essa asked, looking up from her stitching. "Father Miguel Sorrel." Calder affirmed. "He's the only man in Pinon Cross who has stood up to the railroad and won. When Silcox tried to claim the water rights to the wash, Father Miguel organized the farmers and dug a new irrigation ditch, right under the company's nose, citing an old Spanish land grant. He understands land, he understands the law, and he fears God more than he fears Silcox. It's sanctuary, but we can't just walk in." Calder began to map the new terrain, his mind working with the cold precision of a surveyor. "The plan has 4 parts. Delphine, you're the historian. Silcox and Kincaid burned the toll ledgers, but they didn't burn your cellar. You have receipts. Liquor deliveries, tax stamps, invoices for card decks and piano wire. Prove Kincaid was in your saloon, celebrating the manager's death before the body was ever reported. Create a timeline that a child could understand." Delphine nodded, her smoky eyes alight. "I have every piece of paper since 1878. I can nail his hide to the hour." "Lark." Calder turned to the smaller girl. "You're the messenger. There's a new player in town, one Silcox can't buy. Judge Harriet Cole. She's a federal inspector, sent from Washington to investigate these very land disputes. Silcox thinks he can rush his new warrant past her, but she's here to find the truth." He pulled a piece of paper from his evidence bag. Delphine will write a letter, an anonymous tip, detailing what she knows. You will dress as a baker, a girl delivering bread to the hotel. You will get this into Judge Cole's hands. No one else. Can you do it? Lark, who rarely spoke, just gave a single, sharp nod. Good. Now, Esse, he turned to her, his voice softening slightly. Kincaid and Silcox faked a murder. They forged my name, but the warrant, the first warrant, that was Elwell's mistake. Think, when they came to your shop, Kincaid and Elwell, the night they tried to make you sign the Garza paper. What did you see? Essie closed her eyes, her brow furrowing. The memory was painful, wrapped in fear and intimidation. I remember the paper, she whispered. It was thick, expensive, not like territory script, and the wax. Elwell had a stack of letters on his satchel. They were sealed, but one seal was broken. It had fallen on the floor. I picked it up to give it back to him. He snatched it from my hand. His face, he was angry. The seal, Calder pressed. What did it look like? It was dark blue wax, she said, her eyes still closed. It had a bird, a small bird, with its head turned, like a blackbird, or a starling. Yes, a starling. I remember, because my grandmother said they were birds of bad conscience. A starling, Calder repeated, a cold, thin smile touching his lips. Grady Elwell's personal seal. Not the county's, not the railroad's, his own. He's arrogant enough to use his own signet on a fraudulent document. That connects him. That's the key. He turned to Owen Brack, the blacksmith, who had been listening from the shadows. His massive arms crossed. Owen, I need your skill. Not with iron, but with brass. Can you take a description and carve a seal? A stamp that looks like a starling. The blacksmith grunted. Not my usual work, but I've made cattle brands from worse descriptions. It'll be rough, but it'll pass for a copy. It doesn't need to pass, Calder said, his voice dropping. It just needs to exist. It's a trap. We're not going to use it on paper. We're going to let Kincaid see it. We're going to test his conscience. The man who fears the proof is the man who knows it's real. The plan was set. The forge buzzed with a new, nervous energy. Delphine began sorting through a small tin box of receipts she'd saved from the fire. Lark slipped out, bundled as a bread girl. Owen Brack fired up his small casting furnace. Calder turned to Rue. Now for the misdirection. You did well last night. I need you to do it again. Go to the livery, talk loud. Say you saw me, that I bought a fresh horse, that I was complaining about the mud on the Coyote Gate Pass Road. Make them believe we're running south. And us, Esse asked. Standing, her hands clenched. We're going down, Calder said, pointing to the floor. We're taking Father Miguel's route, the old irrigation ditch. Kincaid burned the ledgers, but he can't burn a tunnel. The afternoon played out in a series of tense, quiet moves. Lark returned, her face impassive. She had walked past Silcox's railroad guards, offered Judge Cole a warm roll, and slipped the folded letter into her hand as the judge paid. The judge, a stern-looking woman in spectacles, had paused, looked at Lark, and then tucked the note into her sleeve. Mission accomplished. Delphine, with a stack of paper, had constructed a perfect, damning timeline. Kincaid had bought 3 rounds of celebratory whiskey for his deputies at 4 o'clock, complaining about the warrant work he'd be doing later. The toll manager's body was not discovered until 7:30. By 3 o'clock, Owen Brack had a rough-hewn, but recognizable, brass seal in his hand, a small, passable starling. The trap was baited. Rue's rumor, as Calder had predicted, spread through Pinyon Cross like wildfire. A man running from a murder, kidnapping, an arson charge. Heading for the border, it was the most exciting news since the fire. In the late afternoon, from the cracked window of the forge, they watched the result. Silcox, looking furious, led a half-dozen of his railroad men, all heavily armed, riding hard out of town, heading south. They were taking the bait. They were going for Coyote Gate Pass. But Kincaid was not with them. "Where is he?" Essie whispered, her hand gripping Calder's arm. "He's the local," Calder said, his eyes scanning the empty street. "He's smarter than Silcox's hired guns. He knows the pass is the obvious route. He's letting them chase a ghost." Just then, a small, grim procession moved down the main street. Sheriff Kincaid, on his big bay horse, and behind him, shambling, was Harlan Pike. He was on foot, his hands tied, a rope leading from his wrists to Kincaid's saddle horn. The bounty hunter's leg was wrapped in a bloody, makeshift bandage. He had survived the fire, only to be captured by Kincaid. He was now a prisoner, a leashed dog, his face a mask of black, bitter hatred. Kincaid was dragging him along, using Pike's tracker skills. Kincaid did not ride south. He rode toward the granary, toward the dry, overgrown ditch that ran beneath it. "He knows," Calder said, his voice flat. "He's not taking the rumor. He's checking the hidden ways. He's coming for us." "What do we do?" Rue asked, her voice trembling. "We go," Calder said. He grabbed the bag of evidence and the new fake seal. He looked at Essa. "Stay right with me. Don't look back." He led Essa, Rue, and Delphine out the back of the forge, into a narrow, trash-filled alley. Kincaid and Pike were moving for the ditch entrance by the granary. Calder was taking them to a different entrance, a collapsed cellar 2 streets over that fed into the same network. It was a race, underground, in the dark, against a corrupt lawman who knew the map as well as he did. The Blue Lantern Saloon stood silent as the sun began to set, its blackened timbers a monument to the first battle. The town held its breath, waiting. The next storm, the storm of iron and law, was about to break. The lobby of the Pinon Cross Courthouse was not a grand hall of justice. It was a small, hot, brick-lined room that smelled of dry paper, chewing tobacco, and the fine red dust that seeped in through the windows. It was here that Silcox, his tailored suit immaculate, had unrolled his grand map, the centerpiece of his campaign. The map, Calder noted with a cold fury, was a beautiful, precise forgery of his own work. Judge Harriet Cole, a woman whose stern features were accentuated by small, steel-rimmed spectacles, looked at the map with practiced skepticism. 100 new jobs, Your Honor, Silcox was saying, his voice as smooth and polished as oiled walnut. He traced the proposed rail line with a manicured finger. Perhaps 200, commerce, stability, and a future for this territory. All that is required is the court's signature, releasing these few, fallow, unclaimed parcels for public development. Unclaimed. Mr. Silcox. Judge Cole's voice was dry as the air, or simply undefended. My brief from Washington mentions several ongoing, and rather bitter, land disputes. Grady Elwell, Silcox's lawyer, stepped forward, wiping a sheen of sweat from his upper lip. Mere legal friction, Your Honor, all of which is now resolved. The criminal element responsible for the disputes has been identified. Sheriff Kincaid holds a warrant for their arrest on charges of kidnapping and arson. We are only here to finalize the land transfers. The courthouse doors swung open, the hinges groaning. The sound of the wind was gone, and, in the silence, the sound of 4 sets of boots on the wood floor was deafening. Silcox froze, his smile vanishing as if wiped clean. Elwell turned, and his face went the color of old parchment. Calder Nash stood in the entryway. He was not dressed for a fight. He was dressed as he always was, in the worn coat Essa had mended. But beside him stood Delphine Rooker, her face scrubbed clean of soot, her expression grim. Beside her, his presence a silent, towering rebuke, was Father Miguel Sorrel, and between them, her face obscured by a thick lace scarf, was Isela Montoya. Sheriff Kincaid, who had been lounging by the door, jumped to his feet, his hand instinctively dropping to his gun. "This is a closed hearing. You are under arrest. Nash, all of you." "We are party to this matter, Sheriff," Calder said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room, cutting through Kincaid's bluster. He walked forward, his eyes on the map. He saw the elegant forged signature at the bottom, Calder Nash, Territorial Surveyor. He unslung the heavy leather satchel of San Domingo gold with a deliberate, steady motion. He placed it on the table, directly on top of Silcox's map. The thud of the gold hitting the wood was a sound of final, physical punctuation. "What?" Judge Cole said, her eyes narrowing. "Is the meaning of this?" "That," Calder said, his hand resting on the bag, "is $600 in gold. The posted bounty for Miss Montoya. I am here to redeem her warrant, as is my right under territorial code." Elwell let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh. "That's absurd. You cannot pay a murder warrant." "You can," Calder replied, his gaze locked on Judge Cole. "Section 44, Paragraph B of the Territorial Code. A monetary warrant, issued in a civil jurisdiction, may be satisfied by a public payment to the court, thereby halting execution pending a formal review of the claim. And we, Your Honor, are formally disputing the claim." Silcox's face was a mask of cold fury. "This is theater. That woman is a fugitive, wanted for murder, arson, and the kidnapping of her own co-conspirators, Sheriff. Arrest them." "On what grounds?" "Mr. Silcox," Judge Cole snapped, her sharp voice silencing the room. "All I have is your writ, sworn out this very morning after the fact. Where is the evidence of the original crime, the murder?" Kincaid, flustered, pointed a thick finger. They burned it. They burned the Blue Lantern down. Your Honor, they destroyed all the proof." "Not quite all, Sheriff." Delphine Rooker stepped forward. She was holding a heavy, warped, and badly wine-stained accounts ledger. "My cellar is stone, and my lockbox is iron. This is my purchase ledger for the Saloon, page 82. She laid it on the desk, open, her finger, steady and accusatory, pointed to a line item. 4 o'clock, on the day of the murder," Delphine read, her voice ringing with clarity. "Sheriff Bram Kincaid, 3 bottles of premium rye, the chit, in his own hand, says, 'For celebration.'" A collective gasp went through the townsfolk who had begun to gather in the lobby. "And," Judge Cole continued, her eyes scanning the page, "the official report states the toll manager's body was not discovered until 7:30 that evening. He was celebrating a murder 3.5 hours before anyone knew it had happened." Delphine stated, her voice flat. "She's a liar," Kincaid bellowed from the doorway. "And the charge of kidnapping." Judge Cole looked at the veiled figure. "Miss Montoya." Essie stepped forward. Her voice was low, and it trembled, but it did not break. "Your Honor, I was not kidnapped. I was given sanctuary. I was hunted." She pointed a shaking finger at Elwell. "That man and Sheriff Kincaid, they came to my shop. They tried to force me to sign a paper with a false name. Isela Montoya Egarza. It is not my name. When I refused, they said I had a dangerous memory. The next day, the manager was dead. And that warrant," she pointed at Kincaid, "was on my door." "Slander," Elwell yelped, his face slick with sweat. "She was not at the Blue Lantern Saloon when it burned?" Father Sorrell's voice boomed, silencing the lawyer. "She was in my chapel. She was on her knees in sanctuary from the moment the fire started until dawn this morning. I and God are her witnesses." The evidence was a hammer, blow after blow. The early celebration, the false name, the alibi. Silcox was silent, his eyes 2 chips of ice, but Elwell was visibly unraveling. Judge Cole shuffled the papers on her desk. She picked up the folded, anonymous note that Lark had delivered to her that morning. "I received this curious letter," she said, tapping it. "It makes many of the same claims. It was delivered with this fragment of a wax seal." She held up the small, broken piece of dark blue wax. Elwell's eyes shot to it. He recognized it. The starling, his personal seal, the one he had used on the fraudulent land transfers. "A peculiar crest," Judge Cole mused, watching the lawyer's reaction. "A starling. Is it a family mark, Mr. Elwell?" It is nothing," Elwell stammered, wiping his mouth. A trinket. A common design. Is it? Calder's voice was quiet. He reached into his own coat pocket. He did not produce the warrant or a gun. He produced the small, heavy, brass-carved stamp that Owen Brack had made that morning. He placed it on the desk beside the wax fragment, because this stamp was found in the alley behind the depot office, right where Sheriff Kincaid was seen burning the toll ledgers. It seems a perfect match. Shall we heat some wax, Your Honor, and compare the impression? This was the bluff, the trap, the fake seal, presented as real. Elwell looked at the brass stamp, a crude but recognizable starling. He looked at the broken wax from his own desk. He looked at the judge's cold, appraising eyes. He did not know it was a forgery. He believed they had his seal. He believed they had him. "This is entrapment. This is a conspiracy," Elwell shrieked, his voice cracking, backing away from the table. "I will not be a party to this," Kincaid, watching from the door, saw his lawyer collapse. He saw the muttering, angry faces of the townsfolk pressing in. He saw the gold, the judge, the priest, the woman he thought was buried. He saw the trap spring shut. He did the only thing a panicked animal knows how to do. He acted. He drew his pistol, turned, and fired a single shot straight up into the porch ceiling. Boom! The crowd screamed, scattering back into the street. Plaster dust rained down. "Disperse!" Kincaid roared, his voice thick with panic, smoke curling from his gun. "Get back! This is official county business!" The people moved back, but they did not leave. They stood in the dusty street, their murmurs growing louder. "Guilty," one said. "He's guilty as sin. He's shooting at the courthouse." Outside, Harlan Pike, who was still leashed to Kincaid's horse, had seen the entire scene through the window. He saw the gold. He saw the case collapse. He saw his payday vanishing. "Bram, you damn fool," Pike hissed, pulling on his rope. "Stop shooting. The game's up. Just take the gold, grab the bag, and ride." "It's enough, you idiot. It's enough to get us both to Mexico." Kincaid hesitated, torn between Pike's greedy, desperate logic and the cold, unblinking stare of Silcox, who was trapped inside. Silcox saw his empire of paper and fear dissolving in seconds. The law had turned against him. His lawyer was broken. His sheriff was exposed. He would not be taken. He locked eyes with one of his railroad men, a hard case standing near the back of the lobby. Silcox gave a single, sharp jerk of his head toward the street, toward the large brass fire bell mounted on a post outside the town hall. The man understood immediately. He bolted from the room. Silcox's plan was as brutal as it was simple. A fire alarm. In the chaos, with the crowd panicking, his men would storm the courthouse. A stray bullet would find Essa. Another would find Calder. Kincaid would declare a riot, and Silcox would walk out of the chaos with the gold, the map, and his power intact. The railroad man sprinted across the street, shoving people aside. He reached for the bell rope, but Judge Cole had seen the signal. She had seen the man run. "No," she commanded. She rose to her full, small height, her authority absolute. She pointed at the two armed federal deputies who had been standing behind her. "Deputy, stop that man. Muffle that bell, lock those doors. This courthouse is now under federal jurisdiction." One deputy lunged out the door, drawing his pistol, yelling at the man to stop. The other deputy, a big, grim-faced man, slammed the heavy oak doors of the courthouse shut. The sound was a boom of finality. He dropped the heavy iron bar across them, sealing them all inside. The bell began to clang. Clang, clang, clang outside. Kincaid's voice rose to a scream. "Riot! They're rioting! They're attacking the court!" Inside, there was a terrible silence. Silcox, Elwell, Calder, Essa, Delphine, and the judge, trapped in the room, while outside, the fake fire alarm and the shouts of a corrupt sheriff were turning the town into a powder keg. The courthouse was a trap, and the switchyard was a maze. Kincaid, his face purple with rage, had abandoned all pretense of the law. He had his railroad men, and he had Harlan Pike, who he'd unleashed like a hound. "The ditch!" Kincaid roared, leading half his men into the dark. damp irrigation tunnel that ran beneath the town. The route he knew Calder had planned to use. He was, for the first time, one step behind. Calder had seen Kincaid split his forces. He'd never intended to take the ditch. He grabbed Essa's hand. "This way, Rulark, with me." He didn't run for the open desert or the border. He ran toward the railroad, toward the Cedar Switch Yard, a sprawling, chaotic grid of freight cars, abandoned engines, and piles of coal. It was a labyrinth of iron and shadow, a place where a man could get lost or make a stand. They plunged into the rows of towering boxcars. The air was thick with the smell of coal dust, grease, and the sharp, acrid scent of creosote. Their footsteps on the gravel were loud in the sudden, eerie quiet of the yard. "They're split," Calder panted, pulling Essie behind a massive, rusting water tower. "Delphine, stay with the girls. Keep moving. Follow this line of cars to the main depot. Find Judge Cole. She'll be there. Give her the evidence." "What about you?" Delphine demanded, her hand on the small pistol she carried. "Kincaid knows me. He'll come for me. I'm going to draw him off," he said. He looked at Essa. "Go, now." "No," Essie said, her voice fierce. She pulled her hand from his. "I am not hiding in a cellar again. I am not running. We've finished this." Before he could argue, a new voice cut through the shadows. "He's right. Little Mouse, you should have run." Harlan Pike stepped out from behind a flat car, his pistol level. His leg was stiff, his movements pained, but his eyes were sharp. He was alone. "Kincaid's a fool. He can have the surveyor. Silcox will pay double for you, alive and silent." He had circled, using his tracker's instinct, and cut them off. He was greedy, and he was working for himself. "Pike," Kincaid's voice echoed from the far end of the yard. "Do you see them?" Pike grinned. "A wolf's baring of teeth." "Not a thing. Sheriff, I'm checking the highline." He lunged, grabbing Essa's arm in a brutal grip. He was strong. Despite the leg, he dragged her, shoving her toward the iron ladder on the side of a boxcar. "Up, we're going to get a better view." "Calder!" Essie cried out. Calder drew his gun, but Pike pressed his own pistol to Essa's temple. "Try it, surveyor. Drop the gun, or I'll spill her brains right here on the gravel." Calder let his pistol fall. Pike laughed. "Now you. Up the ladder. Both of you." Slowly. Rue and Lark, who had hidden behind a stack of barrels, watched in terror. Delphine, trapped 50 yards away, could only watch, her pistol useless at this distance. Pike forced them up the ladder onto the long, flat roof of the boxcar. The wind was high here, whipping at their clothes, carrying the bitter smell of engine smoke. The view was clear. They could see Kincaid's men, small, dark figures fanning out through the yard below. A closing net. "Now," Pike said, breathing hard from the climb. "You just sit tight. Soon as the sheriff is gone, we'll go and see Mr. Silcox." He still held Essa, his arm locked around her throat. Essie was trembling, but not from fear. It was rage. She was a seamstress. Her hands were her life. They were small, fast, and precise. Pinned against Pike's chest, her right hand was free. She slowly, carefully, moved that hand to her own hair, to the heavy bun she kept pinned at the nape of her neck. Her fingers found what they were looking for. A long, sharp, steel-forged hat pin. Pike was watching Calder, his attention fixed on the man he saw as the real threat. "Stupid, surveyor, all that gold, and you gave it to a—" His words cut off in a wet, strangled gasp. Essie had driven the hat pin with all her strength, straight down into the top of his thigh, into the already wounded leg. "She's hit the muscle, deep and true." Pike screamed, an unholy sound of pure agony. His grip on her throat convulsed, and he released her, his hands flying to the pin in his leg. "Now, Calder!" she shrieked. Calder didn't hesitate. He launched himself across the roof of the car, a low driving tackle aimed at Pike's good leg. The impact was brutal. The two men hit the roof hard, a thundering boom that echoed through the yard. They were a tangle of limbs, rolling, punching, their boots stamping a deafening rhythm on the metal roof. Pike was a savage, roaring with pain. His hands now clubs. He lost his pistol. It skittered across the roof, stopping inches from the edge. He clawed for it. Calder grabbed his wrist, slamming it against the roof. Below, Rue and Lark saw the fight. Rue, her mind sharp with panic, looked at her banjo. She ripped the spare steel E-string from the case, a thin, coiled wire. "Lark, help me," Pike twisted, his strength born of madness. He threw Calder off, scrambling, his fingers stretching. For the gun! "Here!" Rue screamed from the ground. She had tied one end of the banjo string to a heavy iron bolt. She swung it, underhand. A perfect, desperate throw. The string uncoiled, arcing up. "Caldo, catch!" Calder didn't catch it. He didn't have time. The wire-wrapped bolt snagged, just as he'd hoped, on the iron grab hook on the side of the boxcar, right next to Pike's thrashing arm. The thin steel wire snapped taut, just inches from Pike's wrist. Pike's hand closed on his gun. He roared in triumph, rolling, bringing the pistol to bear on Calder. "Lark now," Rue screamed. Lark, who had run to an open freight car, reappeared, dragging a heavy 50-pound sack. "Flour!" she yelled. With a grunt, she heaved the sack from the car. It burst open as it hit the tracks below. A massive, instantaneous cloud of white powder. The cloud was thick, like a winter fog, instantly obscuring everything at ground level. From the other side of the yard, Kincaid saw the cloud. He saw the figures struggling on top of the car. He thought it was an explosion. He raised his rifle. Fire on the car." He fired. His bullet missed Calder. It missed Pike. It struck a red signal lantern hanging on a pole 20 feet away. The lantern shattered, spraying burning oil onto the tracks below. The oil hit a patch of dry grass. The grass ignited. The flames raced, licking at a pool of spilled kerosene near a fueling depot. "Fire!" a man yelled. "The yard's on fire!" Calder, on the roof, saw the new danger. The car they were on was attached to a string of others, and the fire was racing toward a tanker car marked Danger Kerosene. He forgot Pike. He scrambled for the edge of the car, looking for the brake wheel. The brake. We have to uncouple Pike." Seeing his chance, raised his pistol. At the same moment, on the ground, Silcock stepped out from the warehouse shadow. He had seen the whole fight. He had seen his prize, Essa, standing clear, silhouetted against the sky. He had lost the legal battle. He would not lose the war. He calmly raised his own pearl-handled revolver, taking careful, two-handed aim at the girl on the roof. A single shot rang out, sharp and clean. Silcox cried out, not in pain, but in shock. His pistol hit squarely, exploded in his hand, a mass of shattered metal and wood. He staggered back, clutching his ruined, bleeding hand. Delphine Rooker stepped from the shadow of the same warehouse, 20 yards from Silcox. Her shotgun was still smoking. "My saloon, you son of a bitch!" she said, her voice shaking with cold rage. She had not aimed to kill, she had aimed to disarm, and she had not missed. On the roof. Calder had reached the handbrake. He was pulling, trying to release the car, the iron groaning, Pike on his knees, his face a mask of blood and hate, leveled his pistol at Calder's back. "It's over, Surveyor!" Shuck. The sound from the ground was as loud as a death sentence. Pike froze. He looked down. Judge Harriet Cole stood on the gravel, not 30 feet away, flanked by her 2 federal deputies. One deputy had his rifle aimed at Pike's chest. The other had his pistol on Kincaid, who had just run up. "It is over, Mr. Pike," Judge Cole called out. Her voice as cold and hard as the steel rails. Kincaid looked at the judge. He looked at his men, who were dropping their guns. He looked at Silcox, who was on his knees, moaning, his hand wrapped in a bloody handkerchief. He saw Father Sorrel, standing with a crowd of armed townsfolk who had followed the judge from the courthouse. The circle was not just closed. It was a noose. The fire licked at the side of the tanker car. "Calder, the brake!" Essa screamed. Calder gave one last, desperate heave. With a metallic shriek, the coupling broke. The boxcar, free of the others, groaned and began to roll, slowly, picking up speed, moving away from the fire, carrying Calder, S., and the defeated Harlan Pike into the safety of the open yard. The courthouse lobby was a pressure cooker, thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of E. Silcox's blood from his ruined hand. The fake fire bell had been silenced. The angry, confused shouts from the street had quieted, replaced by the heavy, watchful presence of the townsfolk who now crowded the doorway, their faces grim. They had come for a fire. They were staying for a reckoning. Judge Harriet Cole, her face a mask of iron, stood behind the makeshift bench, a simple pine table. Her 2 federal deputies stood guard, their rifles held at port arms. Between them, looking small and defeated, stood Silcox, his hand wrapped in a bloody linen, and a trembling, gray-faced Grady Elwell. "This hearing is reconvened," Judge Cole announced, her voice cutting through the tension. She did not bang a gavel. She did not need to. Her authority was absolute. She looked at the men who had just been marched in from the switchyard. Kincaid, his face black with soot and fury, his hands cuffed. Harlan Pike, his leg bleeding, his greedy eyes darting between the exits. And finally, Calder and Essa, who stood near the wall, bruised and exhausted, but together. "We have heard allegations of a conspiracy of remarkable depravity," Cole stated, her eyes sweeping over the prisoners. "We will now see the evidence." She gestured to the table, which had become a summary of their crimes. Exhibit A saloon ledger, water damaged and smelling of wine, placing Sheriff Kincaid at a celebration hours before a murder was reported. She pointed again. Exhibit B, a map of the Juniper Wash territory, a beautiful piece of work bearing the signature of Mr. Calder Nash, a signature Mr. Nash himself, a former territorial surveyor, swears is a forgery, used to illegally file claims. Her finger moved to the small, dark piece of wax. Exhibit C, a wax impression, a starling, not the county seal, but the personal signet of Mr. Grady Elwell, used, we allege, to notarize fraudulent documents in a criminal enterprise. Judge Cole fixed her gaze on the veiled woman. "Miss Gisela Montoya, you will approach. You will remove your scarf, and you will tell this court what happened." Essa's hands trembled as she untied the scarf. Her face was pale, smudged with soot, but her dark eyes were clear. She looked not at her accusers, but at the judge. She began to speak, her voice low, but gaining strength with every word. "I am a seamstress. Your Honor, I came to Pinon Cross 2 years ago. I built a small business. I bothered no one." She told the story. She spoke of the toll manager, of seeing him steal from poor families. She spoke of her confrontation with him. "Then they came," she said, and for the first time she pointed a steady finger at Elwell and Kincaid. "They came to my shop at night. They did not come to arrest me. They came to buy me, or erase me." She detailed the meeting, the paper they tried to force her to sign. It was a compensation payment, they said, for my silence, for my shop, but it was a lie. The name on the paper was Gisela Montoya y Garza. It is not my name. My mother was a Reyes. It was a trick, a way to make me a ghost. "And what did you do?" Cole asked. "I refused," Essa said, her voice rising. "I told them I would not sign a lie. I told them I would go to the territorial inspectors. I told them I knew what the manager was doing. And Mr. Elwell," she looked at him, her gaze so pure it was like a physical blow. "He smiled at me. He told me I had a dangerous memory. Sheriff Kincaid told me I should have taken the money." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The next morning, the manager was dead, and the murder warrant was on my door." A low, angry murmur went through the crowd. "We have the matter of the seal," Judge Cole said, turning. "Mr. Owen Brack, step forward." The blacksmith, his massive hands scrubbed clean but still stained with soot, approached the table. He was uncomfortable, his eyes down. "Mr. Brack, you maintain the county's official seals and brands. Do you not?" "I do, ma'am," he grunted. "Is this," she said, holding up the brass starling Calder had given her, "the seal of Pinon County?" Brack looked at the crude stamp Calder had tricked him into making. Then he looked at the wax fragment. "No, ma'am, that's a bird." He reached into his own heavy pocket and produced a heavy, official-looking brass stamp. "This here is the county seal. It's a cactus in a mountain. Ain't no birds." "So, any document," Cole pressed. "A land foreclosure, a warrant. If it bore that starling, it would be a fraud." "It wouldn't be legal," Brack affirmed. "It'd be a man making his own law." Elwell made a small, choking sound and seemed to shrink. "And now, Mrs. Rooker," Cole said. Delphine stepped forward, her back straight. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smoky. "You admit you harbored a fugitive. You admit you obstructed Sheriff Kincaid. You admit you set a fire and discharged a firearm. Why?" Delphine's eyes found Essa. "I knew her mother, years ago, in Sonora. She fed me when I was a hungry singer with holes in my shoes. She was a good woman, a woman of honor. That is a debt. I pay my debts." She then turned her gaze on Kincaid, her eyes flashing with cold fire. "But that's not the only reason. I've lived in this territory for 30 years, Your Honor. I know men like him." She jerked her chin at the sheriff. "I know what happens when a man like that takes a girl with no family, no witnesses. For questioning, she has an accident. She tries to run. She's found in a wash, shot in the back. I hid Essay in my cellar because it was the only way to keep her alive long enough for anyone to hear the truth. I'd do it again." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like stone. Judge Cole now turned to the last man, Harlan Pike. He was sweating, his face pale under the grime, his wounded leg clearly agonizing him. "Mr. Pike, you are a bounty hunter. You are also, as of this moment, charged with conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and firing on a federal officer. You are facing a rope." Pike looked at Silcox, who stared at the floor, his bleeding hand in his lap. He looked at Kincaid, who stared at him with pure hatred. Pike's loyalty, bought and paid for, was gone. He had nothing left but his own skin. He lied to me," Pike rasped, pointing a shaking finger at Silcox. "The whole thing. He lied. Speak plainly, Mr. Pike," Cole ordered. "It wasn't just the $600 bounty." Pike confessed, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. "That was just to get me here. After the surveyor bought the warrant, Silcox found me. He offered me more, a lot more. He said Kincaid was a fool. He said if I retrieved the girl and made sure she and the surveyor had an accident in the switch yard, he'd pay me." "Pay you in what?" "Stock," Pike yelled, his voice cracking. "Not gold paper. He paid me in stock certificates for the new Southern Railroad line, 500 shares. He said they'd be worth a fortune, more than any bounty. Once the land was clear and the girl was silenced, he paid me to kill them both." The confession hung in the air, absolute and damning. It connected every piece. The murder, the land, the railroad, the cover-up, it was all Silcox. Silcox looked up, his face no longer cold, but reptilian with hate. Elwell was openly weeping, and Kincaid snapped. His body, which had been rigid, suddenly coiled. He was a bull, defeated but not broken. He let out a roar of pure, animalistic rage. He was cuffed, but the deputy next to him was weary, his rifle held loosely. Kincaid lunged, not for the rifle, but for the heavy Colt revolver on the deputy's hip. He was fast. His cuffed hand slammed into the deputy, knocking him off balance, his fingers closing on the wooden grip of the pistol. "No!" Calder shouted. But it was Rue who moved. She had been standing near the evidence table, trembling. She had lived in terror of Kincaid for years. She saw him move, and her fear turned, in an instant, to pure, unthinking reaction. She grabbed the nearest object, the heavy, empty water bottle from the judge's table, and threw it, two-handed, like a rock. The bottle spun, end over end, and shattered against Kincaid's temple and wrist. The sound was a sickening, wet crack. Kincaid screamed, a high, thin sound of pain. his hand spasming, his grip on the gun lost. He staggered, blind, blood pouring from a gash on his head. Before he could recover, the spell was broken. The federal deputies did not move. It was the townsfolk, the men from the militia, the farmers, the blacksmith Owen Breck. They surged forward as one. It was not an arrest, it was an avalanche. They buried Kincaid under a pile of enraged bodies, dragging him to the floor, pinning him, the sound of fists and curses filling the room. "Order!" Judge Cole's voice was a whip crack. "Order, get him up! Get him in irons now!" The deputies waded in, pulling the half-conscious, bloody, and definitively beaten Kincaid from the mob. They hauled him to his feet and slammed him into a chair. The room was panting, the adrenaline of the final, violent act ebbing away. Judge Harriet Cole stood, her small frame radiating in power that dwarfed every armed man in the room. She waited until the only sound was Kincaid's ragged breathing. "The bounty on Isela Montoya Uraeus is hereby declared null, void, and fraudulent," she announced, her voice ringing in the silence. "Miss Montoya." She looked at Essa, her expression softening for the first time. "Is declared a material witness in a federal investigation. She is under the protection of this court and the United States government." She then turned to the prisoners. "Elias Silcox, Bram Kincaid, and Grady Elwell, you are to be held in federal custody, without bond, on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, land fraud, and intimidating a federal officer. You will be transported to Prescott to await the arrival of the territorial inspectors." She looked at Pike. "Harlan Pike, you will be held as well, but your testimony will be taken into consideration." The justice was done. The mechanism of the conspiracy was broken. The townsfolk, who had been a single angry mob seconds before, now seemed to release a breath they had been holding for years. They looked at each other, their faces dazed. They looked at the bleeding, cuffed sheriff, the weeping lawyer, and the ruined railroad baron. There was no cheering. There was no grand celebration. A single man in the back of the room, a farmer Calder recognized, slowly began to clap. It was a slow, sparse, rhythmic sound. Another man joined him, then a woman. It was not the applause of a raucous victory. It was the sound of a weary, grateful people who had seen a crooked house finally, painstakingly, pulled down to its foundations. It was the sound of order, barely and at great cost, being restored. The fire was out. Pinyon Cross, which had held its breath for so long, finally exhaled. The smell of wet ash and pine tar hung in the air, but it was the clean smell of an ended fight, not a brewing one. 3 days later, Calder Nash sat on the newly replaced porch of the Blue Lantern Saloon. The front door was new, unpainted wood, and the windows were fresh panes of wavy glass. Delphine Rooker, her arm in a sling from where she'd been knocked against the bar in the final melee, sat opposite him. Between them, on the small table, sat the heavy leather satchel of San Domingo gold. Delphine pushed it toward him with her good hand. "It's yours, Calder," she said, her smoky voice quiet. "You paid the $600, and you paid in blood. What's left? You earned. Take it. Start over. Somewhere clean." Calder looked at the bag. It was the ballast that had dragged him into this, the weight that had held him here. Now, it was something else. It was seed. He shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere, Delphine, and it's not my gold. It's Pinyon Cross's. It's payment for the trouble we caused." He unlaced the heavy bag. He began to divide the canvas pouches into 3 piles. The first and largest he pushed toward her. "This is for the saloon," he said. "For the new bar, for the windows, for every bottle Kincaid's men broke, for a new piano for Rue and Lark." Delphine looked at the pile, her tough exterior cracking for just a moment. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Calder made a second pile. "This," he said, "is for the court. Judge Cole is setting up a territorial fund. It's to hire a real lawyer from Prescott, a good one, to fight those forged land claims. It's to give those farmers their land back, the land Silcox tried to steal using my name." He set aside the third, smallest pile, And this is the Pinion Sewing Fund. Delphine raised an eyebrow. It's for Essa, he explained. To open a new shop, the right shop, on the main street. Enough to buy bolts of wool and canvas, and enough to take on 2 apprentices. She wants to teach. She says a needle is a better weapon than a pistol, if you know how to wield it. He'd kept nothing for himself. Delphine looked at the man who had walked in days ago, a gaunt, haunted drifter. He was still gaunt, but the shadows were gone from his eyes. So, Delphine said, a small, rare smile touching her lips. The surveyor is putting down stakes. The surveyor, Calder said, his own hand resting on the new wood of the porch, is finally drawing a line he can live with. Across the street, in a small shop that had once been a failed assay office, the smell of new paint and cedarwood filled the air. Inside, Isela Montoya was organizing her new workspace. It was bright, the windows large, with a long table for cutting patterns. On the wall, opposite the window, hung a single object, Calder's old, torn, smoke-stained wool coat. She had patched it again, mending the new rips from the fight in the switchyard. It hung there not as a garment, but as a document. It was a map of their shared journey, every stitch a marker, every scar a memory. In the rebuilt Blue Lantern, the hammers were silent, and the piano was being tuned. Rue and Lark, no longer pale and terrified, were on the small stage, rehearsing a new act. It was not a bawdy song. It was a dramatic recitation. And the sheriff, his face like a thundercloud, roared. "Open the cellar," Rue declaimed, her hand on her hip. Lark, playing the part of Delphine, held a broom like a shotgun. "Not while the storm rages. Sheriff, it's bad for business." They both burst into laughter, a sound bright and clean, but their eyes were ho. They were telling their own story, the true one. They were turning their terror into a tale of courage, and in doing so, they were healing the town. One performance at a time, the town's official healing had come via telegraph. Judge Cole, true to her word, had sent a scathing, detailed report to the territorial capital. The Prescott Southern Railroad, its massive fraud exposed, was forced to halt all work. Their charter was suspended. The line would have to be rerouted, 10 miles south, well clear of the Juniper Wash homesteads. Elias Silcox, his hand bandaged, and Grady Elwell, his spirit broken, were taken to Prescott in chains, facing a litany of federal charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, and attempted murder. That night, the first truly peaceful night Pinion Cross had known in a year, Calder and S walked. They left the lights of the town behind, following the dry, moonlit path along Juniper Wash. The air was cool and smelled of mint and damp stone. The only sounds were the trill of insects and the distant, soft murmur of the creek. They walked for a long time in a comfortable, shared silence. They had been through the fire. There was no need for small words. As they reached a rise overlooking the valley, S's hand, calloused from her needle, brushed against his hand, calloused from his surveyor's chain, found hers, their fingers interlaced, not with the desperate, fevered grip of the stable, but with a slow, sure and quiet knowledge. It was not a grasping. It was an alignment. Calder stopped, turning to face her. In the moonlight, her face was soft, the lines of fear and exhaustion replaced by a calm strength he had not seen before. He was no longer a ghost, and she was no longer a victim. He raised his free hand, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He kissed her, and this kiss, unlike the first, held no fear. It was not hidden in shadows or born of desperation. It was as open as the desert sky, as slow and deep as the roots of the mesquite trees around them. It was warm, and it was certain. It tasted of clean air and a future they had chosen, not one they had been forced into. He held her, his arms strong around her waist, and she held him, her hands on his shoulders, grounding him. When they parted, they rested their foreheads together, their breath mingling in the cool air. A small house, he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he was still learning to name. By the wash, with a porch, and a room for a loom, she whispered back, her fingers tracing the patch on his shirt. A big one, and a desk for you, for your maps. He smiled, his hand covering hers. A map with no broken lines, no forgeries, just straight lines, she said, the kind that lead home. The next morning, the sun rose clear and bright. A new, freshly painted wooden sign hung over the door of her shop. It swung gently in the morning breeze. It read, Montoya Nash Conscience Mending Mapping, and beneath, in small, precise letters, a final declaration. No harmful contracts accepted. As they stood there, a small procession crossed the far end of the street. Bram Kincaid, his head bandaged, his hands in heavy chains, was being loaded onto the prison wagon, his journey to the federal prison beginning. The townsfolk who were out, the shopkeepers and the farmers, did not stare. They did not jeer. They simply fell silent, moving aside, letting the wagon pass. It was the way of the frontier. Justice here was not loud. It was just, finally, done. Calder looked at the wagon until it was gone. Then he looked at Essa, who was watching him, her hand in his. He smiled. We're not running anymore, he said. She smiled back, her fingers giving us a squeeze. No, we stay, and we sew up what was torn. Thank you for listening to this story. We would be honored if you would let us know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can all share our thoughts. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you enjoyed this tale, please consider supporting us by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more listeners.